Alderwake looked peaceful beneath the snow, its streets still warm while the rest of the valley froze. Then Vesper, a retired military canine, dragged a Navy veteran out into the night. Beneath the pines lay an exhausted dog with torn paws and a warning tied beneath his collar. His missing owner had discovered something dangerous moving through the pipes below the town. Saving her meant shutting down the system that had kept Alderwake alive for decades. Calder and Vesper would have to decide whether comfort was worth protecting when the truth could poison everything downstream. After the story, tell us what choice you would have made. And please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. The Visitor Beneath the Pines. Alderwake looked warmest in winter. From the ridge above town, the rooftops disappeared beneath smooth layers of snow, while narrow ribbons of steam drifted from grates along Main Street. The sidewalks around the courthouse stayed mostly clear even after heavy storms. Ice rarely settled on the steps of the hotel, and the old brick storefronts glowed against the white valley as though the town had found a private agreement with the cold. People in Alderwake took pride in that warmth. They spoke of the geothermal system the way other towns spoke of rivers, railroads, or founding families. It was proof, they liked to say, that Alderwake had survived because its people knew how to use what the mountain gave them. Calder Rourke had never asked how much of that story was true. For nearly 2 years, he had lived 3 miles beyond the center of town in a cedar-sided house near the frozen edge of Lake Orison. The property included a narrow workshop, an aging woodshed, and a detached storage barn whose floor had begun to settle unevenly sometime before he bought the place. That suited him. He had spent most of his adult life aboard ships, where every valve, panel, corridor, and bulkhead existed for a reason. Even silence at sea had a structure to it. It came from sleeping machinery, distant water, and men waiting for the next alarm. The quiet around Alderwake was different. It did not wait for him. At 57, Calder still carried the compact strength of a man accustomed to narrow ladders and heavy equipment. He stood just over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders but lean at the waist, with the restrained movements of someone who had long ago learned that wasted motion could become danger. His dark brown hair was cut short at the sides and left slightly longer on top, enough for the winter wind to disturb it. Gray had begun to show clearly at his temples. He kept his face clean-shaven. The habit had outlasted uniforms, inspections, and the authority of rank. A faint bend in the bridge of his nose and the pale curve of an old burn across his left hand were the only visible signs that his life had not always been quiet. Most mornings, he repaired motors, winches, and heating units for fishermen and property owners around the lake. He accepted work that could be finished with tools, measurements, and clear consequences. A broken pump either worked again or it did not. A cracked fuel line could be replaced. A faulty switch did not ask whether he had done enough when he first noticed the problem. Rowan Pike, who led the county search and rescue team, occasionally brought equipment to Calder's workshop for inspection. He had invited Calder to join the team more than once. Calder always declined. He did not dislike people. He simply preferred being useful in ways that did not make anyone dependent on him. Vesper understood that preference better than most humans did. The 8-year-old German shepherd moved through the house with a quiet awareness that made every room seem briefly smaller. He was tall and long-bodied, built more for endurance than weight, with deep honey-gold fur beneath a dark saddle that dropped lower over his left shoulder. A small V-shaped notch marked the outer edge of his right ear. Silver hairs had begun to appear around his muzzle, though his dark amber eyes remained watchful and precise. Vesper had retired from military service with Calder. People in Alderwake usually assumed that meant the dog spent his days sleeping beside the stove and waiting for occasional walks. They never noticed how he checked the doors before settling at night. They did not see him pause whenever metal vibrated beneath the floor. 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Lenora Shawcross had arrived at Calder's property with a notebook, a narrow sampling case, and a red-brown cattle dog mix named Tuck. She had introduced herself without ceremony.
"I'm tracking a pressure irregularity," she had said, standing in the workshop doorway while snow melted along the shoulders of her dark teal parka.
"Your property sits above one of the older service lines." Lenora was 54, perhaps, slim and sharp-featured, with brown-red hair streaked by a distinctive silver line near her left temple. Her green eyes seemed to examine statements the way other people examined machinery, looking first for stress fractures. Calder had heard of her. Most people in Alderwake had. She had worked for the state before returning to town and had developed a reputation for asking questions that made council meetings longer. "What kind of irregularity?" Calder asked. "A vibration where there shouldn't be one." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have until I measure it." He had almost smiled. While they inspected the settling floor in the storage barn, Tuck wandered toward Vesper with more confidence than good judgment. He was smaller, with rust-colored patches, a white chest, one upright ear, and one that folded at the tip. His eyes did not match, one chestnut, the other a pale blue-gray. Vesper watched him approach and gave no invitation. Tuck stopped, considered the larger dog, then sat down beside him as though the decision had already been made. Lenora noticed. "He doesn't usually surrender the last word that easily." Neither does Vesper. Later, as part of what Lenora called a memory exercise, she asked Calder for one of his work gloves. She let Tuck smell it, walked the dog around the side of the barn, then released him with a short command. "Find Rourke." Tuck returned directly to Calder, carrying the glove by its repaired thumb seam. The exercise had seemed harmless then, almost unnecessary. Calder remembered it on the night Vesper came through the kitchen door, hard enough to strike the wall. The house had already settled into its evening stillness. A small fire burned behind the iron grate. Calder sat at the table in an old olive combat shirt and worn field pants, rebuilding the corroded switch assembly from a fishing winch. His diving watch lay beside the tools because the steel band kept catching on the wiring. Vesper had been outside making his usual circuit. He did not bark. Instead, he crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, caught Calder's pant leg just above the boot, and pulled. Calder froze. Vesper had been trained to guide, brace, track, and alert. He had never used his teeth on Calder's clothing without a command. "What is it?" The dog released him, moved toward the back door, then returned and pulled again. Not panic, Calder thought. Urgency. He stood, slipped on his field jacket, and took the flashlight from the hook beside the door. The night beyond the house was so clear that the snow seemed lit from within. Moonlight rested across the yard, the woodshed, and the line of pines beyond the barn. The cold struck his clean-shaven face immediately, sharp enough to tighten the skin around his eyes. Vesper moved ahead without waiting. His tracks cut across the untouched snow behind the house. Calder followed more slowly, favoring his right knee as the ground sloped toward the trees. Halfway there, he saw the dark shape. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch. Then one ear moved. Tuck lay beneath the lowest pine boughs, partly sheltered from the wind. Ice had formed along his back and tail. His red-brown harness was torn across one side, and the fur around his paws was dark with blood. Calder dropped to one knee. "Tuck." The dog's mismatched eyes opened, but only the chestnut one seemed able to focus. He tried to raise his head and failed. Vesper stood close without crowding him. His body formed a barrier between Tuck and the open woods, ears angled toward the darkness beyond the trees. Calder ran his gloved hands over Tuck's ribs and legs. No obvious break. Breathing shallow but steady. Severe exhaustion Cold exposure, damaged pads. He found no leash, no human tracks, only a thin line through the snow where the dog had stumbled beneath the branches. Then Calder saw the red strip. A narrow piece of fabric had been tied beneath Tuck's collar. It hung from a small waterproof pouch secured against the inside of the harness, almost hidden by the dog's fur. Calder touched it. Tuck's jaw tightened weakly, not in aggression, but in refusal. "Easy," Calder said. "I see it." The dog did not relax until Vesper lowered his muzzle and touched the edge of the pouch once. Only then did Tuck let his head fall back into the snow. Calder slid one arm beneath the dog's chest and the other beneath his hindquarters. Tuck was not large, but the dead weight of exhaustion made him feel heavier. Calder's knee protested as he stood. He ignored it. Vesper stayed so close to Calder's left side that his shoulder brushed Calder's leg all the way back to the house. Inside, the quiet changed. Calder spread blankets beside the stove and placed Tuck on top of them. He did not move the dog directly against the heat. He warmed towels, wrapped the paws, checked the gums, and set a shallow bowl of water within reach. Vesper lay several feet away, forelegs extended, gaze fixed on the injured dog. "You know him," Calder said. Vesper's right ear shifted. Calder worked in silence for the next 20 minutes. He cleaned the torn pads and found no deep lacerations, only the damage of distance, ice, and rough ground. Tuck had traveled far enough to wear himself open. That meant Lenora was not nearby. The thought arrived before Calder wanted it. He removed the waterproof pouch from the harness. Inside was a folded sheet of field paper, damp at one corner but intact. Lenora's handwriting slanted hard across the page, written with the pressure of someone who had known she might not get a second attempt. "My name is Lenora Shawcross. The North Geothermal Line is contaminated with industrial solvent. Do not allow discharge valve N4 to open. Notify Sheriff Mavis Keene and the Idaho Environmental Response Office. Access is near the old bell tower. Tuck knows the route." Below the message was a rough flow diagram, a pressure threshold, and a time written beside it. At the bottom, Lenora had drawn a small bell crossed by a single dark line. Calder read the note twice, then a third time. He knew enough about pressure systems to understand what the numbers suggested. Not the chemistry, not the geology, but the timing. This was not a frightened woman asking someone to find her. It was a professional warning that something larger than her own life was already moving toward failure. His gaze went to Tuck. The dog slept with his breathing uneven, one torn paw twitching beneath the blanket. He had crossed winter ground, carrying a message from someone who had trusted him to choose the right house. No, Calder thought. Not the right house, the right dog. The heating pipes beneath the floor gave a low, metallic tremor. It was a sound Calder had heard many nights before, brief, dull, easy to dismiss as old infrastructure adjusting beneath the cold. This time, Vesper's entire body tightened. His head rose, his ears drew slightly back. He did not look at Calder. He looked down. Tuck's pale eye opened. Though too weak to stand, he lifted his head a few inches from the blanket and released a thin, strained sound from deep in his throat. The vibration faded. Neither dog relaxed. Calder placed Lenora's note flat on the table beside the scratched face of his diving watch. Outside, Alderwake remained white, silent, and warm beneath the snow. Inside, two dogs listened to something moving under the house. And Calder understood that the quiet life he had built was already over. The woman no one had reported missing. By 7 the next morning, the sky over Alderwake had turned the flat white of incoming snow. Calder had slept less than an hour. Tuck remained on a blanket beside the stove, wrapped loosely enough that he could move if he needed to. He had accepted water during the night and a few bites of softened food near dawn, but every attempt to stand ended with his injured paws folding beneath him. Vesper had not slept at all. He had kept watch from the space between Tuck and the kitchen door, not restless, not protective in the usual sense, but alert to the possibility that the night had not finished delivering whatever it had brought. Calder folded Lenora's note into the waterproof pouch, secured it inside his field jacket, and lifted Tuck carefully. "You're staying in the truck until someone qualified tells me otherwise," he said. Tuck's pale eye opened. Calder could not tell whether the dog understood the words or only the direction of his voice. Vesper followed them outside without being called. The road into Alderwake curved along the frozen lake, where snow had erased the shoreline and made the valley seem wider than it was. At that hour, the town was beginning its ordinary routines. Delivery vans idled behind the hotel. A man in a wool cap cleared powder from the pharmacy steps. Steam rose through grates in the pavement, carrying warmth into the cold air. Nothing in the center of town suggested that a warning had arrived during the night. The sheriff's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building beside the courthouse. Calder carried Tuck through the rear entrance rather than making the injured dog cross the salted front walk. Sheriff Mavis Keene was already at her desk. She was 63, broad-faced and solidly built, with black and silver hair cut close to her jaw. A thin scar interrupted her right eyebrow. Her uniform shirt was gray-blue beneath a heavy brown duty jacket, and a black fountain pen sat precisely aligned beside the morning reports. Mavis looked first at Calder, then at the dog in his arms. "What happened?" "He came to my property last night." She stood immediately. That told Calder more than her expression did. "You know him?" "I know who owns him." Calder placed Tuck on a folded emergency blanket in the corner of her office. Vesper settled beside him while Mavis crouched, careful not to touch the injured paws. "Tuck," she said quietly. The dog opened both eyes. Mavis rose and looked at Calder again. "Where's Lenora?" "That's why I'm here." He handed her the pouch. Mavis read the note once, then turned it over as if expecting another page. Her face did not change, but she folded her gloves together and tucked them beneath one arm, a movement Calder remembered seeing during a road closure meeting the previous winter, just before she ordered half the county highway shut down. "She sent warnings to the council," Mavis said. "Technical complaints, pressure fluctuations, possible contamination. Nothing verified. She wrote a discharge threshold and a time." "I can see that." "Then you know this isn't a complaint." Mavis's eyes lifted. "I know it is one piece of paper written by a woman who has spent 6 months accusing the town of ignoring infrastructure problems." "You say that as though 6 months made her less likely to be right." The room went still. Mavis did not bristle. She was too experienced to waste energy defending herself before she had all the facts. "Lenora leaves town for survey work," she said. "Sometimes for several days. She doesn't report her movements to this office." "When did anyone last speak to her?" Mavis reached for the phone. The first call went to the medical clinic. The second went to the clerk at town hall. The third went unanswered. By the fourth call, Calder could hear a change in the questions. Not, "Has Lenora been in?" "When did you last see her?" The answer was 3 days earlier at the hardware store, buying lithium batteries, marking paint, and 2 replacement filters for a field respirator. No one had reported her missing. No one had known they should. Mavis set the receiver down and looked at Tuck. "She lives alone." "That doesn't make her absence harmless." "No." Mavis picked up the phone again. "It makes it easier for absence to look ordinary." She called Rowan Pike. He arrived 12 minutes later wearing dark rescue trousers and a red and black winter shell, snow still caught across his shoulders. At 46, Rowan had the thick neck and compact build of a man shaped by ladders, hoses, and equipment rather than a gym. Black hair, silvering at the temples, had been cut close around an old burn that left the edge of his left ear slightly distorted. He listened without interrupting while Calder explained how Tuck had appeared, and Mavis summarized what she knew. When he finished reading Lenora's note, Rowan did not ask whether it was credible. He asked, "How long was the dog outside?" "Unknown." "Distance traveled?" "Also unknown." "Can he walk?" "Not safely." Rowan crouched near Tuck, assessed the paws without forcing them flat, then glanced at Vesper. "And yours?" "Fit to track if needed." That wasn't the question. Calder held his gaze. Rowan had invited him to join search and rescue often enough to know exactly what he was asking. Vesper's physical condition was not the issue. "He can work," Calder said. "With limits." Rowan nodded once. "Then we start with the house, not the tunnels. We confirm whether Lenora is missing, determine what she took, and establish a last known movement."
Nobody enters confined space based on a handwritten map.
Mavis reached for her coat. Calder did the same. Rowan pointed at him. "You come because the dogs know you. You do not become the operation." "I didn't ask to." "No. Men like you usually don't. That's rarely the same as not taking over." Calder almost answered. Then Tuck tried to stand. The dog pushed up on shaking forelegs, ignored the pain in his paws, and turned toward the office door. He made one step before collapsing. Vesper rose, moved beside him, and placed his body close enough to stop Tuck from trying again. For several seconds, the smaller dog resisted. Then his weight shifted against Vesper's shoulder. The moment passed without command or praise. Rowan watched both dogs. "He comes with us," he said, "but he stays in the vehicle unless we need a scent decision." Lenora's house stood beyond the northern edge of town, where plowed roads narrowed and the trees closed around the properties. It was a low, cedar-clad building built against the slope, with a detached garage and a metal weather station mounted on the roof. Her truck sat beneath a layer of snow. That was the first thing Rowan photographed. The second was the front step, where no fresh tracks crossed the powder except those made by the arriving group. Mavis unlocked the door with an emergency key held by the county for isolated residents. Inside, the house smelled faintly of mineral water, paper, and cold coffee. Nothing looked disturbed. A mug sat in the sink. A wool blanket had been folded over the back of a chair. On the kitchen floor, Tuck's food bowl remained half full, the dry pieces softened at the edges where water had spilled nearby. Calder stood over it longer than necessary. Lenora would not have left that bowl if she expected to remain away. Rowan moved through the house methodically. He checked windows, doors, medication, clothing, and signs of forced entry. Mavis examined the desk. Calder noticed absence instead of disorder. The dark teal parka Lenora had worn to his property was gone. So were her best winter boots, a field respirator, sampling rods, and the gray-blue backpack that had carried her notebooks. A lighter coat still hung by the door. This had not been an abduction. She had prepared to go somewhere difficult. The dining table had disappeared beneath maps. Water routes, elevation lines, service corridors, pressure readings, and handwritten dates overlapped in layers. Small sealed vials stood in plastic racks, each labeled with a location and time. Several showed cloudy residue along the bottom. Mavis picked up a packet stamped "Received" by the council office. The first pages contained Lenora's formal request for an independent inspection of the northern geothermal line. Attached was a response stating that the existing evidence did not justify emergency interruption during peak winter operation. Beneath it lay a second set of readings. These had not been submitted. The numbers rose sharply over the previous 2 weeks. Mavis stared at them. She held this back. Or she was waiting to confirm it, Calder said. She asked us to act without giving us her strongest evidence. She may not have trusted what would happen to it. Mavis's face hardened, though not at him. That doesn't make keeping it here a good decision. No. For the first time, Calder saw the shape of the problem clearly. Lenora had believed the town would dismiss her. The town had believed Lenora was withholding certainty. Both might have been right, and while they protected themselves from being wrong, something underneath Alderwake had continued to move. A thud sounded from the hallway. Tuck had forced himself halfway out of the vehicle while one of Rowan's volunteers opened the rear door for air. The dog landed badly, but before anyone could stop him, he limped toward the house. "Tuck," Calder called. The dog ignored him. Vesper moved after him, not chasing, simply keeping pace. Tuck crossed the kitchen, passed the table, and went directly to a narrow basement door. He scratched once, slipped on the wood, then scratched again. Rowan looked at Calder. That normal? No. They carried Tuck down the stairs. The basement was part laboratory, part storage room. Shelves held sample bottles, coiled tubing, waterproof cases, and old survey tools. A sump pump clicked in one corner. Vesper began checking the floor. He paused beside a pair of heavy boots under a workbench. Blue-black mud had dried along the soles and lower leather. Rowan photographed them before lifting one. Local soil? Calder shook his head. Mavis crouched. Not from this side of town. Tuck had already moved on. He pressed his nose to an old green tool chest, then clawed at the lowest drawer. The metal rasped against concrete. Rowan opened it. Wrenches, valve keys, grease pencils, a roll of survey tape. Nothing else. Tuck scratched harder. Calder knelt and ran his fingers along the drawer's interior. The bottom sat higher than it should have. He removed the tools and found two recessed screws beneath a stained cloth. The false panel lifted free. Inside was a folded map on waxed canvas. Mavis recognized it before Calder fully opened it. Her silence made Rowan turn toward her. What is it? The Old Meridian Mine. The name had almost vanished from local conversation. Calder had heard it only once, from a fisherman who mentioned a collapse decades earlier, and then changed the subject. The map showed chambers, shafts, ventilation corridors, and service lines extending beneath the northern half of Alderwake. One heavy red line had been added by hand. It connected the old mine infrastructure to the town's geothermal network. Rowan looked at Mavis. You knew these were connected? I knew the town used portions of an older service system. That's not what I asked. Mavis stood slowly. I was told the hazardous sections were sealed before the current network was commissioned. I believed the active loop remained outside the mine chambers. You never verified it? The system predates my office. That still isn't an answer. No, she said. It isn't. There was no defensiveness in her voice now, only the weight of a fact that had become larger while she was speaking. Rowan rolled the map and secured it in an evidence tube. This is now a high-risk missing person operation with a possible hazardous material component. I'm contacting the county, state environmental response, and confined space rescue. Mavis nodded. Calder lifted Tuck again. The dog had exhausted what little strength he had recovered. When they returned outside, Tuck refused to settle in the vehicle. His head remained raised, nose turning toward the western ridge. They followed his attention through the trees. At the center of Alderwake, partly hidden behind the courthouse roof, stood the old bell tower. The bell itself had been removed before Calder came to town. The empty wooden structure was mostly decorative now, rising above a small stone building no longer used for anything except seasonal storage. Tuck whined, not toward Lenora's house, toward the tower. Rowan organized two vehicles and made it clear that no one was entering anything until the rescue team arrived. They drove back through town, then turned onto an unplowed service road behind the courthouse. The old tower stood at the edge of a wooded embankment, its lower stones half buried by drifting snow. Tuck became agitated as soon as Calder opened the vehicle door. This time, Rowan allowed him down, supporting the dog with a wide sling beneath his belly. Vesper walked close on the right, matching the smaller dog's uneven pace. Tuck led them around the tower to a slope screened by young pines. Snow had collapsed inward near the base of the hill. Rowan brushed aside loose powder and exposed the upper edge of a rusted steel door. Dirt, ice, and broken timber covered most of it. There was no way a person could pass through. But beside the frame, where the earth had pulled away from the wall, a narrow opening remained between two rocks. Tuck lowered his head and pushed his nose into it. Vesper sniffed the ground, then moved several feet downhill. He stopped over a shallow track nearly filled by wind-blown snow. Calder knelt. There were no visible boot prints, only irregular depressions, spaced unevenly, leading away from the gap. Paw marks. Some were deep, others barely touched the surface. A few were smeared where the animal had fallen and risen again. They led from the buried entrance toward the forest, toward Calder's house. He looked at Tuck's torn pads, the damaged harness, and the red strip that had marked Lenora's message. Lenora had not simply sent the dog away from danger. She had given him a destination. Tuck had crawled through a space too narrow for her, crossed the winter woods, and found Vesper exactly as he had been taught. Behind Calder, Rowan spoke into his radio, requesting excavation equipment and a structural assessment. Mavis stood before the buried door, snow gathering across the shoulders of her coat. For the first time since Calder had known her, she looked less like Alderwake's sheriff than a woman standing in front of something her town had spent years refusing to see. Calder rested one hand against Vesper's neck. Somewhere beyond that blocked entrance, Lenora Shawcross was still missing. But she had not disappeared without leaving a path. She had entrusted the first part of it to Tuck, and the dog had made it home. The system that kept the town alive. Otis Haraway did not answer his door the first time Mavis knocked. The second time, the curtain beside the front window moved. Snow had begun to fall harder over the eastern ridge, softening the outlines of the narrow house and the workshop attached to its side. A faded yellow cap hung on a peg beside the door. Beneath the eaves, old copper fittings had been arranged in rows, each one cleaned and sorted by size, as though retirement had never persuaded the owner to stop preparing for the next repair. Mavis knocked again. "We know you're in there, Otis." A voice came through the wood. "Then you also know I'm not receiving visitors." Rowan stood 2 steps behind her, arms folded beneath his rescue jacket. Calder held Tuck in a support sling beside the truck, while Vesper watched the house. Mavis kept her tone level. "Lenora Shawcross is missing." Silence followed. Then a lock turned. Otis Haraway opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. He was 68, narrow through the chest and slightly stooped, with white blonde hair thinning across the crown. A short gray mustache sat beneath a large nose. His flannel shirt and canvas work vest carried the permanent stains of grease, metal dust, and wood resin. Even from the porch, Calder could smell machine oil mixed with cedar. Tuck reacted immediately. The injured dog lifted his head and pulled against the sling. Otis saw him. Something in the old engineer's face collapsed before he could hide it. "Where did you find him?" "At Calder's house," Mavis said. "He carried a warning from Lenora." Otis closed his eyes. The chain came off. Inside, the house was warmer than it should have been. Pipes clicked behind the walls, and a cast-iron radiator hissed beneath the front window. Shelves covered nearly every available surface. Some held manuals and binders. Others carried pressure gauges, valve heads, old meters, and metal tags stamped with numbers no longer used anywhere in town. Otis did not ask them to sit. His attention remained on Tuck. "He shouldn't know me that well," he muttered. "He knows your scent," Calder said. That means Lenora brought him here more than once. Otis looked away. Mavis removed Lenora's map from the evidence tube and placed it on the work table. You gave her this. I gave her a copy of a section. You gave her enough to find the old service corridors. She had already found references in county archives. I only showed her which records were wrong. Rowan stepped closer. And then? And then I told her to leave it alone. Why? Otis's mouth tightened. Because she thought truth was the same thing as a solution. Calder glanced around the room. Every object in it had been preserved. None had been thrown away. Otis did not seem like a man who believed old systems stopped mattering simply because people stopped speaking about them. Mavis unfolded the map. Start at the beginning. Otis let out a dry breath. The beginning depends on who is telling it. The version that explains why a contaminated geothermal line runs beneath my town. For the first time, anger entered her voice. Otis heard it. He pulled out a chair and sat slowly, both hands resting on a scarred wooden cane he did not appear to need for walking. Calder recognized the habit. Some men held tools when they needed permission to speak. The old Meridian mine opened in 1959, Otis said. Not silver, like people say now. Mostly molybdenum and tungsten. Enough to keep 300 men employed when the timber mills started closing. He pointed to the northern section of the map. The lower chambers were wet. Hot water came through the rock, especially after drilling. The company built pumps, return lines, settling basins. They used industrial solvents to clean the machinery and degrease the piping. TCE? Rowan asked. Otis nodded. Trichloroethylene. Common then. Cheap. Effective. Nobody talked about what happened when barrels leaked. He stopped. Tuck lay against the blanket near Calder's boots, but his mismatched eyes remained fixed on Otis. 34 years ago, Otis continued, a solvent fire started in a maintenance bay. The ventilation failed. Then part of the north wall collapsed. 4 workers died, Mavis said. 4 officially. The room changed. Mavis stared at him. Otis rubbed his thumb along the cane's worn handle. A 5th man was working off the books. Seasonal labor, no contract. The company denied he was ever underground. Rowan's expression hardened. Name? Emmett Rusk. Why isn't he in the records? Because the company was already close to bankruptcy. Another death meant another family, another lawsuit, another investigation. And the town accepted that? Calder asked. Otis looked at him. The town accepted what it needed to believe. The old bell had rung during the fire. Not by ceremony, Otis explained, but as an emergency signal. Before radio systems were common, one long alarm from the tower meant mine accident. Residents had gathered near the square while ambulances struggled up the service road. Halfway through the warning, the bell rope snapped. The official story later blamed heat damage and age. The real reason was simpler. The maintenance entrance beneath the tower had shifted during the collapse, twisting the frame and pulling the bell mechanism out of alignment. The tower removed the bell the following spring and sealed the lower chamber behind fresh stonework. They said the tower was unstable, Otis said. That was easier than explaining what lay beneath it. The mine closed. The company dissolved. The records were divided among county storage, private attorneys, and offices that no longer existed. For several years, the tunnels remained untouched. Then came the winter of 1997. Otis stood and walked to a shelf where an old photograph leaned behind a row of gauges. He carried it back and set it on the table. The image showed Main Street under waist-deep snow. Storefront windows were boarded. A line of adults waited outside the courthouse beside fuel cans and blankets. The hotel roof was buried almost to the second-floor windows. The state highway closed for 11 days, Otis said. Propane deliveries stopped. The municipal boilers failed. Pipes burst in the clinic, the hotel, half the houses near the lake. Mavis had been young then, but she remembered. Everyone in Alderwake did. 3 adults had died during that cold spell. 1 from exposure, 2 after medical equipment failed during the power outages. The geothermal project began in secret that same winter. A former mine engineer named Hollis Dane proposed using the hot water wells beneath Old Meridian. The town council approved emergency work without permits, arguing there was no time to wait for environmental review. The temporary system became permanent. Pumps were installed. Return lines were connected. Heat exchangers went beneath the courthouse, hotel, clinic, and central streets. By spring, Alderwake had survived. By the following winter, the sidewalks stayed clear. Tourism returned. Businesses reopened. No one wanted to ask whether the source of that miracle had ever been safe. The active loop was supposed to remain separate from the old solvent chambers, Otis said. That was the promise. Was it true? Mavis asked. For a while. Otis moved to another section of the map. His finger traced a thick line toward the north. Rock shifts, seals fail, old steel corrodes. The town kept expanding the system, but every council treated the last repair as proof the whole network remained sound. Calder studied the diagram. Explain N4. Otis took a grease pencil. The geothermal network worked as a closed circulation loop. Heated water rose through a production well, passed through heat exchangers beneath the town, then returned underground through a separate line. A balance tank absorbed pressure changes. The check valve here is failing, Otis said, marking the map. Water is pushing backward through the northern return. And the balance tank? Rowan asked. Partially frozen. The insulation around it failed last season. Mavis turned sharply. Was that reported? Otis did not answer at once. That means no, she said. I filed a maintenance recommendation. With whom? The Utilities Committee. Which recommended what? That we postpone shutdown until April. Mavis stood very still. Otis continued before she could speak. If the return pressure reaches the emergency threshold, the system automatically opens discharge valve N4. It keeps the pipes beneath the square from rupturing. And sends the water where? Calder asked. Otis pointed to a narrow drainage route on the map. Into the old cooling channel, then downhill to Clearwater Creek. The creek joined the river less than 2 miles south of town. Mavis looked toward the window, though the waterway was hidden behind the snow. If Lenora's samples are right, then opening N4 pushes contaminated water into the river. And if we stop it from opening? The weakest joints are under Main Street. A rupture could fill service spaces with steam, lift pavement, undermine foundations. Rowan leaned over the map. How much time? That depends on the actual pressure. Lenora wrote a threshold and a deadline. Otis read the figures. His face lost what color remained. She adjusted for the frozen tank. You didn't? Mavis asked. I didn't know how completely it had frozen. The first official result arrived by phone just before noon. Mavis placed the call on speaker. Dr. Miriam Vale introduced herself from the Idaho Environmental Response Laboratory. Her voice was controlled and exact, without the false reassurance people sometimes used when giving bad news. The sample labeled North Return Access 3 shows compounds consistent with trichloroethylene contamination, she said. The concentration requires immediate confirmation and containment planning. Is it dangerous? Mavis asked. At the detected level, it should not enter a public waterway. I am dispatching a mobile team, but weather is delaying transport. Could it be an isolated sample? Yes. It could also represent migration from a larger source. Until we know which, no discharge from that line should occur. After the call ended, no one spoke. The heating pipes inside Otis's wall gave a small metallic click. Calder saw Mavis look toward them. For years, those sounds had meant warmth. Now, they meant pressure. By early afternoon, the argument had moved to the council chamber. Warren Sloane arrived before anyone summoned him. He owned the largest hotel in Alderwake and held one of the senior seats on the town council. At 61, he remained a tall, broad man, though his burgundy vest pulled slightly across his stomach. His silver hair had been combed back with care, and a short gray goatee sharpened a face reddened by cold. He listened to Mavis, Rowan, and Otis. Then he said, "You cannot announce chemical contamination on preliminary results." Mavis stood near the council table with both gloves folded beneath one arm. "You heard Dr. Vale." "I heard one sample." "You also heard that the discharge cannot be allowed." "And if we shut the heat down tonight? The hotel is full. Restaurants have winter bookings. Half this town depends on the next 8 weeks. Rowan replied, "That is not a reason to risk a waterway. It is a reason to confirm before we destroy ourselves." Calder watched Mavis. The argument was not simple because Warren was not entirely wrong. A rumor could empty the town before a laboratory completed its work. Adults would lose wages. Businesses already operating on narrow margins would close. But water did not care about payroll. Pressure did not pause for consensus. Mavis looked at Otis. "How many times did Lenora ask for an inspection?" 4 formal requests. "How many times did the council delay?" Warren turned on him. "We delayed a shutdown. We did not refuse testing." "You funded surface testing," Otis said, "not the old chamber access." "Because it would have required closing half the network." Mavis's expression changed. Not shock, recognition. She had not been deceived by one person. She had accepted fragments from many people because each fragment allowed the town to continue. "I thought I was preserving stability," she said quietly. Warren frowned. "You were?" "No. I was protecting myself from asking what stability depended on." No one answered. Outside, Rowan's rescue team assembled near the old tower. Calder returned with Vesper and Tuck, while Mavis remained at the chamber to prepare county notifications. Tuck's paws had been wrapped and placed in temporary protective boots. He could walk only with the support sling, but the closer they came to the tower, the more determined he became. Instead of approaching the buried door, Tuck turned toward the rear slope. Vesper followed. They crossed beneath low pine branches to a rusted ventilation housing half covered in snow. A narrow iron grate sat above a vertical shaft. Tuck stopped beside it. Below came a long, uneven vibration. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to be felt through the soles of Calder's boots. Vesper froze. His head lowered. The notch in his right ear pulled back. His weight shifted away from the grate, and his breathing shortened. Calder understood the reaction before anyone else did. On ships, vibration traveled through steel. A failing pump, a twisted bulkhead, a rupture behind a wall. Sometimes the body heard danger before the mind identified it. "Vesper," Rowan said carefully. Calder raised one hand. No command. He unclipped the lead. Vesper remained where he was. Calder did not reach for him. He did not reassure him with words that meant nothing. He simply stood close enough to be present, and far enough to leave the choice intact. Tuck moved to the edge of the grate. The smaller dog looked down the shaft, then back at Vesper. He waited. Snow gathered along his rust-colored back. For several seconds, Vesper did nothing. Then he stepped forward, one pace, then another. He stopped beside Tuck, their shoulders nearly touching. The vibration came again. Vesper did not retreat. Calder looked toward the tower, the town beyond it, and the steam rising from streets built over forgotten tunnels. Alderwake had survived because people once made a desperate choice. The danger had not begun with that choice. It had begun when desperation became tradition, and tradition became something no one was permitted to question. At the grate, Tuck lowered his nose toward the darkness. Vesper stood beside him. Neither dog knew what the system was, but both could feel that it was no longer holding quietly. The warning was never only about Lenora. By mid-afternoon, the old bell tower no longer looked abandoned. County vehicles lined the service road behind the courthouse. Portable floodlights had been raised around the buried entrance, though daylight still filtered through the snow clouds. Rescue workers moved equipment from truck beds in practiced order: ventilation fans, gas monitors, rope bags, medical cases, collapsible tripods, and sealed containers for contaminated clothing. Nothing about the operation resembled the hurried rescue Calder's instincts wanted. That was intentional. Rowan Pike stood at the center of the staging area with a clipboard braced against one forearm. He assigned sectors, checked radio channels, and repeated the same rule to every person who approached the entrance. No one goes below grade until air, structure, and retrieval are ready. Calder had heard similar language aboard ships. Preparation always sounded slowest when someone might still be alive. He wore a dark thermal shirt beneath a waterproof technical shell. A full body harness sat over his shoulders and hips, though Rowan had made it clear that the gear did not grant permission. "You are here as a systems advisor," Rowan told him. "Not lead rescue, not command." "I understand." "Say it back." Calder looked at him. Rowan waited. "I am not in command." "Good." Vesper stood beside Calder in his olive working harness, the small tracking light on his shoulder switched off for now. Tuck rested in a padded carrier near the heated command tent. His wrapped paws made walking difficult, but whenever the wind carried air from the exposed ventilation shaft, his head lifted. The dog had stopped trying to force his way toward the entrance. Calder was not sure whether that meant exhaustion or trust. Inside the command tent, 3 maps covered a folding table. Otis had added forgotten service lines in grease pencil. Mavis had marked the boundaries of the geothermal network beneath downtown. Rowan had layered rescue access points and potential collapse zones over both. A 4th map remained incomplete. It was Lenora's. Her markings followed water, not tunnels. Arrows crossed chambers the mine plans treated as sealed. Dates and chemical readings ran along the margins. Near the northern return line, she had written 3 words twice. "Pressure is migrating." A laptop on the table chimed. Dr. Miriam Vale appeared on the screen from the State Environmental Response Vehicle still making its way through the storm. She wore square, dark-framed glasses and had pinned her black curls low behind her head. Her voice remained as controlled as it had over the telephone, but the numbers she delivered left no room for reassurance. "The confirmation sample exceeds the state action level," she said. "This is not background variation." The North Return is carrying trichloroethylene and breakdown compounds at concentrations that cannot be discharged. Mavis leaned toward the screen. "Can the system remain active if N4 stays closed?" "Not without pressure control." Otis answered before anyone else could. "The return line won't hold indefinitely." Miriam looked toward his image. "Then you need to isolate the source, divert the contaminated water, or shut down circulation before the emergency discharge activates." "How long?" Rowan asked. "Based on the readings Lenora recorded, less than 18 hours. Possibly much less if the frozen balance tank worsens." The tent seems to contract around that answer. Outside, pumps, boilers, and buried lines continued warming Alderwake as if nothing had changed.
Miriam continued. The state is issuing an emergency containment order. No discharge to Clearwater Creek. Begin shutdown planning and prepare for localized evacuation if there is any sign of line failure.
Warren Sloan, standing near the back of the tent, removed one glove and checked the silver pocket watch he carried from habit. "Localized?" he asked. "Which streets?" Mavis pointed to the map. "Main, Courthouse, the East Hotel block, and the Lower Clinic Road." "That is not localized. That is the center of town." "It is the area above the oldest joints." Warren's jaw tightened. "And you intend to tell people what? That the heat under their homes may rupture or poison the river?" "The truth," Mavis said. "The truth without a solution becomes panic." "No," Calder said. "Uncertainty hidden too long becomes panic." Warren turned toward him. "You don't employ 63 people in this town." "No." "You don't have reservations booked through March, vendors waiting to be paid, or staff who lose their housing if the hotel closes." "No." "Then don't speak as though facts arrive without consequences." Calder accepted the blow because it was true. Facts did have consequences. So did silence. Before the argument could deepen, one of Rowan's technicians entered, carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside lay a compact orange device streaked with mud. "Recovered from the ventilation housing," she said. "Wedged behind the grate." Otis recognized it first. "Field recorder." The device had been built for wet environments, with sealed buttons and a thick rubber casing. Lenora's initials were scratched into the back. Rowan photographed it, logged the recovery, then handed it to Calder because his hands were steadier with damaged electronics. The casing had survived. The display had not. Calder removed the battery, dried the contacts, and transferred the storage card into an adapter from the command kit. Several corrupted files appeared. Most were incomplete, short bursts of static, breathing, metallic impacts. Then one file opened. Lenora's voice filled the tent. "January 14th. North Control access. Pressure increase is not caused by seasonal demand." The recording crackled. "I found reverse flow beyond the check valve. Contaminated water is entering the return loop from an older chamber east of Meridian 6. A pause followed, marked by the sound of movement and Tuck's collar tags. "If N4 opens, the discharge reaches Clearwater." Her voice remained technical, but the effort beneath it was audible. "I notified the council that the system requires shutdown. I did not send the newest concentrations because I believed the records might disappear before the state received copies. That was my decision. It may have been the wrong one." Mavis closed her eyes briefly. The recording continued. "The old plans reference a containment basin west of the maintenance gallery, clay-lined, built before the mine expansion. If the diversion valve still exists, the return flow may be redirected there temporarily." Otis stepped closer to the laptop. "No," he whispered. "What?" Rowan asked. "That basin was abandoned before I started." Lenora's voice went on. "I'm going only as far as the control platform. I will disable automatic discharge and confirm the diversion route. I'm not entering the lower gallery." A violent metallic sound interrupted the sentence. The recording struck something. Tuck barked once in the background. Then Lenora gasped. For several seconds there was only scraping and loose material falling. When she spoke again, the distance between her and the recorder had changed. "Tuck?" The dog whined. "Stay." Another collapse echoed through the file. "I'm below the platform. Left leg pinned or broken. Tuck is above me." Her breathing sharpened, but her voice did not lose direction. "There is an opening along the west brace. Too narrow for me. Enough for him." Calder looked toward the heated carrier outside the tent. On the recording, fabric tore. "Tuck, find Vesper." The command came once,
Clear, familiar, final. Then softer. Go. The next sound was Tuck struggling through metal and stone.
Lenora remained alone after that. The file ended 6 minutes later, with her describing the approximate position of the diversion valve and repeating one sentence. Do not spend the rescue window only on me. No one in the tent moved. Until then, the operation had held 2 goals: find Lenora and contain the system. The recording made them inseparable. She had known rescuers might have only enough time to choose one. Rowan stopped the playback. We do both, he said. It was not bravado. It was an operational decision. He divided the teams immediately. One group would excavate the primary maintenance door. Another would survey the western vent route and prepare a confined space entry. Otis would continue reconstructing the diversion line. Calder would help compare mine-era controls with naval pressure isolation systems, but only from the surface until Rowan approved otherwise. Della Quinn arrived before sunset. She moved into the command tent carrying a bright orange clipboard, a radio, and a steel thermos tucked beneath one arm. At 52, Della had the practical energy of someone who measured crisis in available rooms, fuel levels, and working generators, rather than speeches. I need addresses, not worst-case language, she said. Mavis gave her the projected rupture zone. Della began writing. The community hall has backup heat for 60 adults. The East Warehouse has space, but no plumbing. Sloane's ballroom can hold another 100 if the hotel generator is sound. Warren looked up. It is sound. Then I need keys and a staff list. You're assuming evacuation. I'm assuming pipes don't wait for agreement. He held her gaze. Then he unclipped the heavy brass hotel key ring from his belt and placed it on the table. Use the ballroom first. Keep guests out of the west wing. That boiler loop is older. Della nodded once. No gratitude, no judgment. The action was enough. Mavis stepped outside to address the town. Word had already spread. Adults gathered behind the barricades near the courthouse, hotel employees, restaurant owners, retired miners, seasonal workers, and residents from the central blocks. Some wore work clothes beneath winter coats. Others had come directly from shops, aprons and name tags still visible. Warren stood among them rather than beside the officials. Mavis did not use a podium. She stood on the courthouse steps with snow collecting in her silver dark hair and told them the geothermal system might release contaminated water into Clearwater Creek. She explained the pressure risk beneath Main Street. She stated that the system had operated for years without complete licensing and that town officials, including her office, had failed to investigate the warnings deeply enough. The crowd did not receive honesty with noble silence. A restaurant owner shouted that his pipes would freeze. A hotel employee demanded to know whether her building was safe. An older man accused Lenora of trying to destroy the town. Someone else asked why the sheriff had waited until now. Mavis answered the last question first. Because I accepted assurance where I should have required proof. The noise thinned. Not because people forgave her. Because she had given them something blame could not easily deflect from. Miriam's mobile environmental unit arrived at dusk, lights moving through the falling snow. She stepped from the vehicle wearing a dark cobalt parka and carrying a white sample case with orange locks. At Mavis's request, she repeated the findings directly to the crowd. She did not dramatize them. She explained what TCE was, what remained uncertain, and why preventing discharge mattered. She also made clear that a temporary shutdown did not mean Alderwake would become uninhabitable overnight. Fear did not disappear. It became specific. That made action possible. People began moving toward Della's registration tables. Hotel workers offered room lists. A mechanic volunteered 2 portable generators. Restaurant owners began inventorying food that would spoil if power failed. Adults from the lakeside road offered trucks for transport. The community did not unite in one emotional moment. It reorganized because there was work to do. Calder stood near the tower with Vesper beside him. He remembered another room years earlier, another system no one wanted to interrupt, another report reduced to acceptable language because delay had seemed easier than disruption. Back then, he had believed rank protected people from the burden of incomplete truth. Now he watched Alderwake argue, accuse, calculate, and still begin preparing. People were frightened. Some were selfish. Some were generous. Most were both. But they were no longer ignorant. Inside the command tent, Otis had marked a location west of the main gallery. "The diversion valve should be here," he said, "if the basin still holds." "Should?" Rowan asked. "I haven't seen it in 31 years. Rowan studied the map, then looked toward the buried tower entrance. Outside, machinery began removing snow and collapsed timber from the maintenance door. The sound rolled through the ground beneath Calder's boots. Vesper felt it and looked up at him. Calder rested 2 fingers against the scratched face of his diving watch, then lowered his hand. For years he had treated silence as the absence of responsibility. Alderwake was teaching him otherwise. Sometimes silence was a decision, and sometimes the first honest act was not knowing how to save everyone, but refusing to pretend they did not deserve to know they were in danger. Beneath the bell tower that no longer warned anyone. The first opening into Old Meridian was wide enough for a man just after midnight. Rowan's crew had spent hours removing snow, broken stone, and warped steel from beneath the bell tower. The work was slow because the entrance had not simply been buried. The surrounding earth had shifted against it, pressing the upper frame inward and leaving the masonry above unstable. Portable lights washed the tower in hard white glare. Steam from generators drifted through the falling snow. Every tool that entered the opening was logged. Every worker wore a harness connected to a retrieval line. Rowan stood at the threshold in a red helmet, checking the carabiners on Calder's chest for the second time. "Radio test." Calder pressed the transmitter clipped near his shoulder. "Rourke to surface." Della's voice answered from the command tent. "Surface reads you." Rowan checked the seal of Calder's respirator, though neither man was wearing the mask over his face yet. "Gas readings are clean through Sector 2, Rowan said. "If the monitors climb, the dogs stop. No debate." "Agreed." "If the structure shifts, we turn around." "Agreed." "If Lenora is in reach and the corridor fails, we follow your call." Rowan studied him for a moment, perhaps looking for the part of Calder that might ignore the answer once another life was visible. Then he nodded. Vesper waited in his olive working harness beside Calder. The dog's amber eyes moved between the dark entrance and Tuck, who stood several feet away in a broad support sling. Tuck had been given pain medication, fluids, and protective boots over his damaged paws. A veterinarian from the county had argued against allowing him underground at all. Rowan had nearly agreed, but Tuck remained the only living witness who knew Lenora's route. He would enter only through monitored zones, supported when necessary, and would be removed at the first sign of distress. Calder crouched beside him. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. Tuck looked past him into the tunnel. Vesper stepped forward and touched his nose briefly to the smaller dog's shoulder. That was the closest either animal came to ceremony. Rowan entered first. The passage beneath the tower descended through stone steps slick with condensation. Fresh braces had been installed along the upper section, each beam stamped with orange paint to show it had been inspected. The walls narrowed quickly, swallowing the sounds from the surface. Calder followed with Vesper. A rescue technician named Marla Chen supported Tuck with the sling behind them. Marla was compact, quick-handed, and spoke only when the operation required it. A 4-gas monitor hung from her vest, chirping softly at regular intervals. The air smelled of wet stone, rust, and something faintly sweet beneath both. Industrial solvent, Calder thought. Or perhaps the knowledge of it changed what he believed he smelled. The first corridor had once been a service route. Old ceramic insulators clung to the walls. Corroded brackets held pipes that no longer carried anything. Every 20 feet, Rowan stopped, checked the structure, and waited while Marla read the gas monitor. Tuck moved with increasing purpose. He could not pull hard without hurting himself, but his body angled forward whenever the team paused. At the first junction, he turned left before Rowan opened the map. Otis's voice came through the radio from the surface. Left passage reaches the north control platform. Right goes toward ventilation and storage. Rowan marked the turn. They continued. The deeper they moved, the less the tunnel resembled a forgotten mine, and the more it resembled a system that had never truly stopped being used. Newer electrical conduit ran beside century-old rock bolts. Sections of insulated pipe crossed over hand-cut drainage channels. Maintenance tags from different decades hung beside one another. Calder ran his light across a valve wheel painted blue. Someone had serviced it recently. The town had called this place sealed. The tunnels themselves disagreed. At the next junction, Tuck stopped. He sniffed both routes, then strained toward a descending corridor partially blocked by fallen mesh. Vesper did not follow. Instead, the German shepherd moved toward the opposite wall and lowered his nose near a narrow strip of dry concrete. He traced it several feet, paused, then looked back at Calder. Tuck pulled harder toward the blocked route. Marla adjusted the sling. "He wants that passage." "That may be the way Lenora usually went," Calder said. Rowan crouched near the floor. The blocked corridor held several old paw prints preserved in gray dust. Some were sharp. None disturbed the thin layer of debris from the recent collapse. Vesper's route showed something different. A faint smear of mud, fresh enough to retain a dark edge. Calder pointed his light toward it. "Tuck remembers the route. Vesper has the newer scent." Rowan examined both sides, then chose the right passage. Tuck resisted. The small dog twisted in the sling and looked back toward the collapsed route, confused by a world in which memory no longer led to the person he loved. Vesper returned to him. He did not push or correct him. He simply stood at Tuck's shoulder, facing the newer trail. Tuck's mismatched eyes moved from the blocked corridor to Vesper. Then he turned. They continued together. The route narrowed beneath a bank of active return pipes. The first vibration passed through the floor like distant machinery starting. Vesper slowed. Calder felt the movement in the leash before he saw it in the dog. The German shepherd's stride shortened. His ears drew back. His head lowered until his nose nearly touched the concrete. A second vibration came, stronger than the first. Metal answered metal along the ceiling. Vesper stopped completely. Rowan turned. Calder raised one hand, asking for silence. In the old years, he would have used a command. One sharp word, a familiar tone, a structure strong enough to carry both handler and dog through the moment. That method had worked until it had not. Calder loosened the lead. Tuck took 3 uneven steps forward. Then he stopped. He looked back. No whining, no pulling, only waiting. The tunnel held the sound of water moving under pressure. Vesper's breathing remained shallow. Calder could see the conflict in the angle of his body. Every trained instinct pointed forward, while memory held him in place. Calder did not touch him. "You know the way back," he said quietly. The words were not a command to advance. They were permission to retreat. Vesper looked at him, then at Tuck. He moved one paw forward. The next step came more easily. By the time he reached Tuck, the smaller dog had turned toward the darkness again. They walked on shoulder to shoulder. Calder followed with a realization he did not like because it arrived too clearly. Trust was not proven when fear disappeared. It was proven when leaving remained possible. The gas readings began to rise near the remains of the North Control platform, not to a level that endangered the masked rescue crew, but too high for the dogs. Rowan stopped beside a widened alcove where clean air was being pushed through a portable ventilation line from the surface. This is their limit. A second team had prepared the alcove as an animal holding point. It contained thermal blankets, water, a first aid kit, and an anchored line. Tuck protested when Marla guided him toward it. His body stiffened, his pale eye fixed on the corridor ahead. Calder knelt in front of him. "You brought us this far." Tuck tried to move around him.
Vesper stepped between the smaller dog and the passage. For one moment, Tuck looked betrayed. Then Vesper lay down, not blocking him with force, staying with him. Tuck stood uncertainly before settling beside Vesper, though his head remained raised. Calder removed Vesper's lead from his own belt and secured it to the anchor. The German shepherd watched him prepare to leave. "You stay." This time it was a command. Vesper held Calder's gaze, then looked at Tuck. Calder could not tell which of them the dog had chosen to obey. He pulled his respirator over his face and followed Rowan deeper. Beyond the animal station, the passage became a low-maintenance gallery. The sweet chemical odors strengthened. Water shone in shallow channels along the floor. Their masks turned breathing into a mechanical rhythm. The North Control platform had collapsed into the level below. A section of steel grating hung at an angle from bent supports. Beneath it lay a narrow void, littered with rock, tools, and twisted railing. Rowan shone his light downward. "Lenora!" No answer. He called again. A faint sound returned. Not words. 3 taps against metal. Rowan lowered himself to one knee. "Lenora, this is County Rescue. Tap twice if you can hear me." 2 taps answered. Calder felt something inside his chest release, though nothing had yet been solved. The access opening was too unstable to enter directly. Rowan called for shoring equipment while the team examined an eastern maintenance wall where the original plans showed a crawl space. A fractured panel had shifted outward, leaving an opening just wide enough for a rescuer. Rowan tested it. "You're broader than I am," Calder said, "and your knee is worse." "I can fit." "That isn't the standard." Another vibration moved through the gallery. Dust fell from the overhead braces. From below came Lenora's voice, weak but recognizable. "Pressure gauge." Rowan leaned down. "Say again?" "The gauge is wrong." Her words broke between breaths. "North return higher than it shows." Rowan looked at Calder. Time had changed shape again. They installed 2 temporary braces along the fractured wall. Rowan checked each contact point before allowing Calder through. Calder entered feet first, lowering himself into the maintenance void. The space was barely high enough to crouch. His right knee protested immediately. He kept his weight low and moved by placing 1 palm at a time against the floor. Lenora lay behind a fallen section of railing. Her teal parka was torn at the shoulder and dusted gray. Brown-red hair had come loose from its braid, the silver streak at her left temple bright beneath Calder's headlamp. Her left leg was trapped beneath a bent support, but the greater danger was the cold. Her lips had lost color, and her hands shook despite being pressed beneath her arms. Her broken phone lay near the wall. "You took your time," she whispered. Calder crouched beside her. "You hid the door." "That was before I needed it." Rowan entered behind him with a hydraulic spreader and medical pack. He assessed Lenora's leg, checked circulation, and wrapped a thermal blanket around her upper body. "Can you tell me where the diversion valve is?" Calder asked. Lenora closed her eyes briefly. "East maintenance wall, behind the old pump housing, not on the modern plans. Otis thinks the line reaches the clay basin."
It does. Her breath caught. The old gauge is under reading. Calibration spring is corroded. Pressure will peak earlier. How much earlier? Hours. Not 18. Rowan looked toward Calder. Get that to surface. Calder transmitted the warning. Static swallowed half the words, but Della confirmed receipt. Rowan positioned the spreader beneath the bent support. The steel groaned as pressure increased. Lenora's eyes opened sharply. Tuck? Alive, Calder said. He found us.
Her expression changed. Not relief alone, but something more fragile, as if she had allowed herself to believe only in the task until that moment.
Is he here?
At the clean air station. Bring him only when Rowan says it's safe. Even injured, she remained herself. The support lifted enough for Rowan to free her leg. He splinted it in place and called for the stretcher team. Before they moved her, Rowan ordered another structural check. Only after the overhead grating had been secured and the path cleared did he authorize Marla to bring the dogs forward as far as the outer edge of the chamber. Tuck heard Lenora before he saw her. His entire body pulled toward the opening, but Marla kept the support sling firm. Lenora was carried into view on the stretcher. Tuck, she said. The dog stopped. For several seconds, he stood 3 paces away, trembling so hard the red harness shifted against his ribs. Lenora lifted one hand. Come here. Tuck crossed the space slowly.
Then he pressed his chest against her side and lowered his head beneath her palm. He did not bark. Lenora's fingers closed weakly in the fur behind his ear. Vesper stood nearby. Calder signaled for him to follow as the stretcher team prepared to move. The German shepherd did not come. He stepped toward Lenora instead and took position on the open side of the stretcher, between her and the dark gallery. Calder called his name once. Vesper looked back. The choice in his expression was not defiance. It was assessment. Tuck was exhausted. Lenora was weak. The corridor remained unstable. They needed him more. Calder felt the old instinct rise, the need to restore order, call the dog back, keep the familiar bond intact. He let it pass. Stay with them, he said. Vesper turned forward again. The stretcher team began the slow climb toward the surface. Tuck moved beside Lenora in the support sling, while Vesper walked on her other side without being handled. Calder remained with Rowan near the damaged platform. Through the radio came Otis's voice, strained by the new pressure estimate. We have less time than we thought. Calder watched the dogs disappear around the bend with Lenora between them. Vesper had entered the tunnel because Calder asked him to trust. He left the deepest chamber by trusting his own judgment. For the first time since they came home, Calder did not feel abandoned by that independence. He felt proud of it. A truth no valve could close. Lenora left Alderwake before dawn. The county ambulance moved slowly through the storm, carrying her toward the regional hospital, with Tuck secured beside the stretcher in a padded crate. Vesper remained at the tower until the doors closed, then stood in the road, watching the red lights disappear between the snow-heavy pines. Calder did not call him away immediately. The rescue had ended for Lenora. The emergency beneath the town had not. Inside the command tent, Otis had spread 3 generations of system drawings across the folding tables. The oldest had been drafted in ink on linen. Later repairs had been added in pencil, grease marker, and red municipal stamp. None matched perfectly. Rowan removed his helmet and leaned over the plans. Walk us through it again. Otis pointed to the northern return line with a wooden folding rule. The diversion gate sits at the old pump station. If I open it, the contaminated flow should shift west toward the clay containment basin. Should? Rowan asked. The basin has not been used in 31 years. And N4? Calder traced the route below the bell tower. Manual closure from the lower gallery. Automatic control is damaged.
Someone has to isolate the discharge after Otis starts the diversion.
Order matters, Otis said. Open the diversion too late, and N4 releases to Clearwater. Close N4 too early, and pressure backs into Main Street.
Rowan looked at both men. You make no independent changes. I monitor pressure from the surface manifold. Otis moves the diversion gate on my count. Calder closes N4 only after I confirm flow has shifted. Calder nodded. Otis did not. His eyes remained on the old map. If I divert now, the central loop loses circulation. That is the point, Rowan said. It also loses heat. The system is already being shut down. Shutting it down in sequence is one thing.
Sending hot water into a dead basin during a freeze is another.
Lines could lock solid before morning. Rowan's voice stayed even. The alternative is contaminated discharge or a rupture under downtown. Otis folded his rule. I know what the alternatives are. Outside, Della's voice carried over the command radio, assigning transport to residents from the East Hotel block. Generators rumbled near the courthouse. Alderwake had begun preparing for cold before the heat was actually gone. Calder watched Otis listen to those sounds. The old engineer had spent most of his life keeping warmth beneath the town. Every building that remained lit seems to argue against the decision he was being asked to make. Rowan replaced his helmet. We move in 5 minutes. Vesper rose when Calder approached the tunnel entrance, but Calder placed one hand against the dog's chest. Not this time. The air readings remained too unstable near N4, and the work required tools, masks, and both hands.
Vesper would stay at the clean air station with Marla. The German shepherd looked toward the opening, then back at Calder. Calder knelt and checked the olive harness, though there was nothing wrong with it. You already did your part. Vesper did not seem convinced. Calder understood. For years, work had been the language between them. One went because the other went. Staying behind could feel too much like failure. It isn't. Vesper's ears shifted. Calder touched the notch in the right one, then stood. This time, when he entered the tunnel without him, Vesper did not pull against the lead. The lower gallery felt warmer than before. Condensation ran down the walls in narrow streams. The active return pipe shuddered inside its brackets, each vibration stronger than the last. Calder wore a full-face respirator and carried a compact hydraulic wrench, a breaker bar, and a thermal camera strapped to his chest. Rowan accompanied him as far as the junction, then stopped at the monitoring station, where temporary pressure sensors had been fitted to the line. Otis worked from the old pump room 2 levels above, connected by radio. Della remained at surface command, relaying information when rock and steel interfered with direct transmission. Pump station to gallery, Otis said. I'm at the diversion gate. His voice came through with a wash of static. Rowan checked the digital gauge. Hold position. Calder reached N4. The valve stood behind a corroded maintenance cage, its wheel larger than his torso. Rust had fused along the stem housing. Mineral deposits covered the lower flange in pale scales. A thin thread of water escaped from the joint. Calder aimed the thermal camera. 162 degrees Fahrenheit. Too hot for skin. Hot enough to turn a small leak into a serious injury if the joint opened further. He fitted the hydraulic wrench over the valve nut. Rourke set. Otis? Rowan asked. Set. Current line pressure is 146 and rising. The old plans listed 158 as the automatic discharge threshold. Lenora had warned that the gauge under-read. No one knew by how much. Rowan continued. On my count, Otis opens diversion 20%. Calder, you do nothing until I confirm west flow. Otis answered first. Understood. Calder followed. 3, 2, 1. Open. Metal groaned through the radio.
At first, the pressure reading did not change. Then it climbed. 148. 149. Otis, status. Gate is moving. Reading still rising. It hasn't seated against this pressure in decades. Do not force past 20. If I stop now, it may lock halfway. Rowan looked toward Calder. Hold N4. Calder kept both hands off the tool. The leak along the flange grew from a thread to a steady line. Hot water struck the floor channel and sent up a veil of vapor. 151.
Above them, somewhere beyond stone and frozen streets, the town continued drawing heat from the same system they were trying to disable. Otis's breathing came over the radio. Then the sound of a wrench striking metal. Gate at 15%. Need 20, Rowan said. I know what you need. Another metallic blow. 152. Calder saw the flange tremble. Rowan, joint movement at N4. How much? Visible. Leak increasing. Can you stabilize? Not while it's live. Otis cut in. Let me keep central circulation for 3 more minutes. No, Rowan said. If I bleed the main loop gradually, we can preserve heat in the clinic and hotel while the diversion opens. You alter flow now, we lose the pressure model. I built the pressure model. You built parts of the system. That is not the same thing. The radio went silent. Calder recognized the moment, not because of the machinery.
Because he had seen men reach it before, when procedure demanded they destroy the thing they had spent years protecting. Otis had repaired those pipes through blizzards, shortages, and councils that refused replacement budgets. He had probably saved homes from freezing more times than anyone knew. Now the responsible act was to stop saving the system. Otis, Calder said. Static answered. You can preserve the loop for a few minutes. Then what? No response. You'll still have the bad line. You'll still have N4. You'll only make the next man decide under worse pressure. Otis's voice returned quietly. There may not be a next man. Calder looked at the leaking flange. That doesn't make this one yours to postpone. For several seconds there was only the violent hum of water inside steel. Then Otis said, Opening to 20. The gate moved with a sound like a deep door being dragged through stone. Rowan watched the gauges. 153. Then 152. 150. A second sensor flickered to life. West flow confirmed, Rowan said. Calder, close N4. Calder engaged the hydraulic wrench. Nothing moved. He increased pressure. The wrench strained against the corroded nut, but the stem held. Valve seized. Use manual assist, Rowan said. Calder fitted the breaker bar through the wheel spokes and pulled. His right knee slipped on the wet floor. Pain shot upward, sharp enough to blur the edge of his vision. The valve did not turn. The flange leak widened. Hot water struck his outer sleeve and flashed into steam. The protective shell held, but the impact drove him back. Rourke, withdraw if joint separation increases. Calder reset his footing. The scratched face of his diving watch pressed against the inside of his glove where he had secured it beneath the sleeve. Years earlier, aboard a vessel far from Idaho, he had reported a leak that others called manageable. Each delay had been reasonable on its own. Inspection after the next exercise.
Replacement at the next port. Shutdown after the next schedule window. The accident had not begun with one reckless choice. It had been built from decisions that sounded temporary. Calder tightened both hands around the bar. Applying again. He pulled. The wheel shifted less than an inch, but it shifted. Movement, he said. Continue in small increments, Rowan replied. Calder worked the valve back and forth, breaking corrosion rather than forcing a single turn. Each motion released a grinding vibration through the stem. The pressure dropped to 147, then stopped. Otis's voice returned. Diversion gate is binding at 22%. Can it hold? Rowan asked. For now. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. The radio crackled. Della broke in from the surface. Main Street heating alarms are reporting loss of circulation. Clinic is switching to backup. Hotel East Wing is cooling. Otis heard every word.
Calder imagined him in the pump room, one hand on the gate control, watching gauges that had defined his life.
Otis, Rowan said, complete diversion. If I do, central return collapses. Complete it. A long pause. Then Otis answered, opening fully. The decision arrived without ceremony. No speech, no request for forgiveness. Only the sound of an old mechanism moving farther than it had in 3 decades. West flow increased. Pressure at N4 dropped. Calder turned the wheel again. This time the valve moved a quarter turn, then half. The leaking joint shuddered but held. Continue, Rowan said. Calder worked until the resistance changed beneath his hands. The stem seated. The line tremor softened. N4 closed. Rowan checked the sensors twice. Confirmed. Discharge isolated. Above them, Otis said nothing. The northern loop pressure continued falling as contaminated water shifted toward the clay basin. Clearwater Creek remained untouched. Alderwake's geothermal system went dark, section by section. The change reached the town faster than most people expected. Steam stopped rising from street grates. Snow began collecting on Main Street instead of melting. Radiators cooled in the courthouse, the clinic, and the hotel. Pipes knocked once inside old walls, then became silent. Della's emergency plan took over. The hotel ballroom became the largest warming shelter. Warren stood near the entrance in an old navy and silver ski jacket, handing out brass room keys and directing staff to move beds from the west wing. He looked exhausted and angry, but he did not close the doors. The community hall filled with folding cots, blankets, and propane heaters. Adults arrived carrying food from restaurant freezers, medical supplies, fuel cans, extension cords, and portable stoves. No one called it unity. Some worked while still blaming one another. That evening, the public meeting was held in the hotel ballroom because the council chamber had lost heat. Mavis stood before residents with every known system record stacked on a table beside her. Miriam joined by video from the environmental field unit. Lenora spoke briefly from her hospital bed, her voice weak but direct. I withheld the final sample set, she said. I believed the council would delay again or bury the records before the state saw them. A man near the back shouted, So you risked the whole town because you didn't trust us? Lenora did not retreat. I risked more by trying to carry the evidence alone. The room quieted. I was right about the contamination, she continued. I was wrong to believe that made every decision I made correct. Otis arrived late. He wore the same stained canvas vest, but without his yellow cap. In his hands was a metal document box. He placed it beside Mavis. Inspection logs, deferred maintenance, private contractor reports, council correspondence, everything I kept out of the municipal archive. Several residents demanded his arrest. Others shouted that he had saved the town for decades. Both claims contained pieces of truth. Otis faced them without lifting his voice. We repaired the system as though every temporary fix bought us time. Then we used the time to make another temporary fix. He looked toward Warren, then Mavis, then the workers and business owners packed into the room. No one morning turned us into liars. We arrived here one delay at a time. Mavis announced that the records would be released to state investigators. Her own decisions would be included. She accepted independent review of her office and the council's emergency actions. Warren stood. You have destroyed the winter economy, he told her. Mavis did not deny it. We may lose businesses because of this. Yes. People may leave. Yes. His anger faltered because she offered no easy defense to strike.
Then Warren looked around the ballroom his hotel was heating at his expense. "I'll keep this shelter open," he said, "but don't mistake that for agreement." "I won't," Mavis replied. Calder had intended to remain silent. Then someone asked why any of them should trust another expert, another official, or another man with a map. He stood near the back with Vesper beside him. The room turned. Calder did not move toward the front. "Years ago, I reported a fuel system problem aboard a ship," he said. "The report was accepted. The repair was delayed." He kept his voice flat. Every reason for delay sounded responsible. Schedule, readiness, cost, operational need. I knew enough to question it, but I also knew the system was larger than me. So I let procedure become permission not to push harder. Vesper leaned lightly against his leg. People were injured later. I did not cause the leak. I also cannot claim I did everything I could once I knew doubt was justified. No one interrupted. The most dangerous moment is not always when people know nothing. Sometimes it is when they know enough to suspect the truth and decide suspicion is easier to live with than disruption. He sat down before the room could turn the words into absolution. There was none. By midnight, state officials had suspended Alderwake's authority to operate the geothermal network. Otis's license was revoked pending investigation, though Miriam requested that he remain as a supervised technical advisor because no one else understood the system completely. Mavis signed the order releasing every municipal record. Warren returned to the shelter desk. Outside, snow covered the streets that had once stayed clear through every storm. Alderwake had not been saved in the way stories usually promised. The river remained clean. Lenora remained alive. The town remained standing. But the warmth was gone. The investigation had begun, and no one could return to the version of Alderwake they had believed in the day before. They had avoided the worst disaster. Now they would have to live honestly with everything that remained. The winter no longer warmed by secrets. 3 months after the shutdown, Alderwake had learned how quickly a town could become unfamiliar to itself. Main Street no longer steamed after snowfall. Plow crews worked before dawn, and by noon the snow had already begun collecting again along the curbs. Portable heating lines ran through the hotel, clinic, and community hall in thick, insulated sleeves. Fuel trucks came twice a week when the highway remained open, and every building posted a temperature plan beside its entrance. The town had not frozen. That was not the same as saying it was well. 4 shops had closed before February. The bakery moved its ovens into the hotel kitchen because its own pipes could not be trusted. A block near the courthouse had been emptied after engineers found cavities beneath the pavement where leaking heat had weakened the soil. At night, several houses stood dark. The people who left did not always announce it. Some simply packed trucks, handed keys to neighbors, and drove south before another storm arrived. Warren Sloane's hotel remained open, but fewer than a third of its rooms held paying guests. Most of the occupied rooms belonged to displaced residents, state engineers, and environmental contractors. He stopped wearing his burgundy vest during those weeks. Instead, Warren moved through the building in an Old Navy sweater with a ring of master keys at his belt. He spent mornings arguing with insurers and afternoons carrying supplies to the ballroom shelter. Anger had not left him. It had changed shape. He no longer argued that the system should have remained open. He argued that Alderwake should not be abandoned simply because doing the right thing had made the town expensive to save. Otis sold his workshop in March. The buyer was a contractor from Boise who wanted the property for equipment storage. Otis kept only his hand tools, the folding wooden rule he carried for most of his career, and one yellow cap he no longer wore in public.
The rest of the sale went into the Municipal Recovery Fund. No one had asked him to do it. Some residents called the gesture too little. Others tried to turn it into an act of redemption. Otis rejected both descriptions. "It's arithmetic," he told Calder when they stood outside the empty workshop on the final day. "The town paid for my judgment longer than it should have. Now I pay something back." His voice held no expectation that payment could balance the account. Mavis remained sheriff through the emergency transition. The State Review criticized her office for failing to escalate Lenora's earlier warnings and for relying too heavily on utilities reports supplied by the same officials responsible for operating the network. No criminal charge followed, but the findings stayed public. Mavis read every page. Then she announced that she would not seek another term. Until the election, a civilian oversight panel reviewed emergency decisions, contracts, and infrastructure records. Mavis attended every meeting, even when residents used the public comment period to ask why she had not questioned the system sooner. She answered without repeating the same apology. She had learned that remorse became another form of control when it demanded that other people accept it on schedule. Lenora returned to Alderwake near the end of March. She walked with a black metal cane topped by a wooden handle. Her left leg remained stiff, and climbing stairs required patience she did not naturally possess. Tuck moved beside her in his repaired red harness, no longer limping but still carrying a thin scar across one front pad. Her house remained inside the environmental survey zone, so she rented a small cabin near Lake Orison. It stood less than half a mile from Calder. Neither of them commented on the convenience. Lenora spent mornings reviewing water samples with Miriam's state team and afternoons reconstructing her lost field records. She also began submitting every result to 3 separate archives. One copy went to the state, one to the town, one to a public digital registry anyone could inspect. She had not become more trusting. She had become less willing to make distrust the reason she worked alone. Calder changed more quietly. He did not accept a title from the town or join any committee. When Warren suggested he supervise infrastructure security, Calder declined before the sentence ended. But twice a week, he reported to Rowan's rescue facility. He taught volunteers how to read old system diagrams, how to recognize where newer repairs had been drawn over older hazards, and how to mark uncertainty instead of turning assumptions into facts. He helped build confined space training frames from discarded pipe and steel panels. He never called it leadership. Rowan did not argue over the word. Vesper attended most sessions. The German shepherd still moved with discipline, but age had begun to settle more visibly along his muzzle. When volunteers dropped tools or dragged steel across concrete, he sometimes lifted his head sharply. Once, a loose panel struck the floor with a hollow, metallic crash. Vesper stepped backward. Calder saw every old reaction pass through him, the lowered body, the ears drawn back, the moment of stillness before instinct chose a direction. No one called his name. No one asked him to demonstrate recovery. Vesper moved to the open doorway, stood there for several breaths, then returned and lay beside Calder's workbench. Calder continued teaching. Afterward, Rowan asked whether they should avoid that training setup in the future. "No," Calder said. "We should secure the panels better." He looked at Vesper. "He doesn't need the world to become quiet. He needs to know he can leave and still come back." That evening, Tuck found them near the frozen shoreline. Lenora followed more slowly, planting her cane carefully in the packed snow. Tuck ran directly to Vesper, circled him once, then headed toward the lake path as if expecting both dogs to follow. Vesper looked at Calder. Calder made no gesture. The dog went anyway. For a moment, the sight reached somewhere in him that rank, service, and habit had kept protected for years. He had once thought being needed was the measure of a bond. Vesper had taught him otherwise. A bond strong enough to survive choice was different from dependence. It was also harder to control. That was why it mattered. 14 months after the night Tuck arrived beneath the pines, Alderwake held its first winter festival since the shutdown. The event was smaller than the ones the town remembered. There were no luxury travel packages, no heated outdoor dining tents, and no polished ice sculptures lining Main Street. The tourism budget had been cut twice. Several buildings remained closed, and the new district heating network served only the clinic, community hall, hotel, and part of the central residential block. The project had cost more than estimated. Environmental cleanup had taken longer. Some former residents had not returned, but the first phase operated under a public permit, with independent monitoring and shut-off procedures posted where everyone could read them. Every tunnel had been mapped. Every abandoned chamber carried a status label. No corridor had been erased because knowledge of it was inconvenient. The morning of the festival, snow began before sunrise. By 8, the unfinished pavement heating sections had disappeared beneath several inches of powder. Rather than delay the event, Della placed shovels along Main Street and assigned clearing zones. Adults arrived in work gloves and winter boots. Hotel employees cleared the path between the ballroom and the square. Restaurant owners shoveled around the food stalls. Retired residents worked more slowly near the courthouse steps, while younger construction crews handled the heavier drifts. No one posed for photographs while doing it. The work was too ordinary for symbolism, until someone stopped to look. Warren stood outside the hotel beside several former employees whose hours had never returned to what they had been. His coat was open, despite the cold, and the brass key ring at his belt struck his leg as he pushed snow from the curb. The hotel had survived. Barely. He no longer spoke of restoring Alderwake to what it had been. He spoke about keeping enough of it alive for something new to grow. Across the square, Otis stood with 3 young engineers over a weatherproof plan table. His folding rule rested beside a digital tablet. He pointed toward one section of the new network, explaining why the access panel had been moved above ground. One engineer asked whether the old location would have been more efficient. "Yes," Otis said. "Then why change it? So the next person doesn't have to crawl underground to learn what we should have written down." There was no applause. The engineer simply made a note. Mavis worked inside the public information tent in a gray coat without her sheriff's hat. Maps of the new system hung on the walls beside the final state findings. Residents could ask questions, request records, or submit concerns without waiting for a council meeting. Her replacement would take office in 6 weeks. She had not decided whether to leave Alderwake afterward. For once, she allowed the decision to remain unfinished. Near the creek monitoring station, Lenora collected a winter sample with Miriam. Her dark coat reached below her knees, and her cane stood planted in the snow beside the equipment case. Tuck sat close enough that his shoulder touched her boot. The water test was clean. Lenora read the result twice. Then she wrote it down and handed the form to Miriam for a second signature. Calder watched from the edge of the square. Vesper stood beside him in his old olive harness. The dark saddle along his back had grown rougher with winter fur, and the silver around his muzzle showed clearly against the snow. A metal shovel slipped from someone's hand near the information tent. It struck the pavement with a sharp clang. Vesper's head lifted. His body tightened. Calder felt the familiar moment arrive. He did not reach down. Vesper looked toward the sound, then toward the open street beyond the festival. He could have moved away. No leash held him. Tuck came running from the creek station. He stopped several yards from Vesper and gave one short bark. Not an alarm, an invitation. Then Tuck turned toward the square where several adults were carrying a wooden sign into place. Vesper looked at Calder once. There had been a time when Calder would have interpreted the glance as a request for permission. Now he understood it differently. Vesper was not asking what he was allowed to do.
He was making sure Calder knew where he had chosen to go. The German shepherd stepped away from him and followed Tuck. Calder let him. Then he left the edge of the square and walked after them. The wooden sign was raised beside the entrance to the new utility center. It did not name a donor, a council member, an engineer, or the people who had stopped the discharge. It carried a simpler promise. Every system map remains public. Every warning receives an answer. Some residents disliked the wording. They thought it sounded like an admission placed too close to a celebration. That was exactly why Mavis had approved it. Snow continued falling as the festival opened. It settled on the rebuilt sidewalks, the hotel roof, the information tent, and the roads that still required human hands to keep clear. Alderwake looked less magical than it once had. The streets no longer remained warm through every storm. The town was poorer, quieter, and marked by empty storefronts no ribbon or public speech could disguise. But the water below the ridge remained clean. The old records were open. The new valves carried inspection dates beside them. And when people heard a strange vibration beneath a floor, they no longer accepted warmth as proof that everything was safe. Calder reached the center of the square as Vesper and Tuck moved among the workers. Lenora looked up from the sample station. Rowan raised one gloved hand from beside the rescue booth. Otis continued explaining the plans. Warren kept shoveling. Mavis handed a resident a copy of the system report. No one had been restored to the person they were before the truth came out. Perhaps that had never been the purpose of truth. It had not preserved their old lives. It had taken away the version of Alderwake that could survive only while nobody looked too closely. What remained was colder, harder, less certain. It was also real. Calder placed both hands on a shovel and joined the others clearing the path. Ahead of him, Vesper walked beside Tuck without waiting to be called back. This time, Calder did not mistake distance for loss. He followed them into the winter the town had finally chosen to face awake. Sometimes the hardest choice is not between right and wrong, but between what is right and what feels easier to preserve. Alderwake survived only when ordinary people stopped protecting a comfortable silence and accepted the cost of truth. In our own lives, we may also notice a warning others ignore, a conversation we keep postponing, or a truth that could change everything. Courage begins when we decide not to look away. Perhaps God's guidance does not always arrive as a clear miracle. Sometimes it comes as a restless conscience, a faithful companion, or one small sign asking us to pay attention. If this story spoke to you, share what it made you think about in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about courage, loyalty, and the choices that shape who we become. May God give you wisdom when the truth is difficult, strength when doing right has a cost, and peace as you take the next honest step.